I've been thinking in the last little while on this journey of the discovery of faith. I thought specifically of Peter. And we have talked about this in the last couple of times. I've mentioned Peter. Peter was a fisherman. Peter didn't have a lot of education. Peter perhaps struggled through life in a lot of ways. He was brash. He was fearless. If he was thinking it, he was saying it. He maybe didn't have a great filter. These are things that kind of come out of the Gospels quite a bit. I was thinking of Peter the other day, and I thought of his journey with Christ. And we find that he shows up, first of all, in about Matthew chapter 4, where Jesus is walking along the shore, and he calls to Peter and to James and to John and Simon. And he says, "Come follow me, and I will make you." Oftentimes in the journey of faith, we want to know, Lord, what are you calling me to? We want to know things like, and we would say even, Lord, are you calling me to be a Billy Graham? Are you calling me to be a great evangelist? Are you calling me to do some great and powerful thing in the world today? And Jesus mostly just says, "Come and follow me, and I will make you." To Peter, he said, "I'll make you to become a fisher of men." This was Matthew chapter 4, where Jesus calls Peter. Jesus didn't tell Peter how he was going to die. He didn't tell him all of the challenges of his life. He didn't tell him, you'll see great and powerful things. You'll do great and powerful things. He just said to him very simply, "Come follow me, and I will make you." Further on in chapter 6 of Matthew, down towards verse 14, somewhere around there, we have the Lord's Prayer, where he said, "Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be your name." And you know that prayer. Down towards the end of that, in verse 14, Jesus said this. He said, "If you forgive men their trespasses against you, your heavenly Father also will forgive you. But if you don't forgive men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive you." And Peter was there when this was said, and knowing the type of character that Peter was, I can imagine that this would shock him. I can imagine that he'd be saying, hold on a minute, in this journey of faith, you're telling me some of these things like this. You're saying I have to forgive people to be forgiven. You're saying that life is about forgiveness, that this journey of faith is about forgiveness. This was part of the education of Peter. This was part of the journey of the discovery of faith, that it actually had something to do within his own heart, had something to do within himself. Another one is Matthew chapter 6. In verse 23, Jesus is with the disciples, and the storm comes up on the ocean, on the Sea of Galilee. And there Jesus calms the storm, and everybody falls back and says, "What manner of man is this?" That in these events of life, and these are spread over a number of years, that in these events of life, Peter is discovering who Christ is. He's discovering that it is possible to have faith in God because of what Jesus is doing and what he's seeing and how this is translating in his own life. We have in Matthew chapter 10 that Jesus sends them out 2 by 2. And he says to them, power is given to you that you can cast out demons, you can heal the sick, you can cleanse the leper. And then Jesus goes on and he says, now, peace I leave with you, and when you come into a home, you need to leave peace on that house as well. And so the disciples come back from that, and what they find there, they're all excited, and they're really pumped, and they're saying, "Lord, even demons had to obey us." And it was a remarkable journey in this discovery of faith. And part of the discovery of faith is that they were discovering that they could actually trust what Jesus said. You see, in our discovery of faith, we come to a point where we need to trust what God says. Further on in Matthew chapter 14, about verse 28, there we have that Jesus has sent the disciples on in a boat, and they're going across the lake, and he stayed to pray, and he's going to dismiss the people. He just fed the 5,000. And so he comes walking to them on the water, and Peter's all excited about this. And Peter says, Lord, if that's really you, bid me walk with you on the water. And most often you hear sermons on that, Peter getting out of the boat and get out of the boat and do all this. But there's a key element that seems to have been missed on so many occasions. And it's this. Peter had to have confidence in who Jesus was for him to say, if it's really you, if it's not a figment of my imagination, if it's not something I've just dreamed up, but Lord, if it's really you, ask me to come to you on the water. This is a pivotal moment in the discovery of faith for Peter. We go on a little bit farther. We have on Matthew chapter 17, Jesus has taken Peter, James, and John, three of them. They've gone up onto the Mount of Transfiguration. And up here on the mountain, what is happening is that Jesus is showing them what it's like to be involved in a prayer meeting with him. And he's praying, and things are changing. The world is changing around him. The atmosphere is changing. And Moses and Elijah show up, and they're having a conversation about what's going to happen next. Peter's all excited. Peter comes running to Jesus, and he says, Lord, it's great that we're here. What we need to do is we need to build 3 shelters, and we can just live on the mountaintop. And Jesus doesn't say anything, but all of a sudden there's this voice from heaven, and it's God himself speaking, and says, Peter, you need to be quiet. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. This discovery of faith takes a step deeper every day of the journey. This discovery of faith, we find Peter the fisherman, and he moves from the occupation of fishing and the occupation of boats and the occupation of gear. And we see him move through the steps and through the stages of following Jesus. And as he's following Jesus, he's learning and he's doing and he's being and he's sensing. But he's discovering faith. He's discovering confidence in Jesus. You remember a little farther on that Jesus, as he began to talk about the Last Supper, he began to talk about his body, he began to talk about blood, he began to say to the people things that were really hard for the people to hear. People began to question who he was, they began to turn away, and Jesus said to the disciples, he said, will you also leave me? And Peter speaks up then, and he says, Lord, where will we go? For you have the words of life. You see, in the discovery of faith in Peter's life, he's come to this place where he's seen, he's sensed, and now he understands the words of life that are coming from Jesus. We move on a little bit, and we find in Matthew chapter 26, we find Peter's denial of Christ. And we have to ask the question, where does the denial of Christ by Peter, where does that factor into the discovery of faith? You remember how the story goes, I suspect, that Jesus said to Peter, he said that everybody's going to leave him. And Peter said, no, I'm not going to leave you. And Jesus said, no, I've got to be crucified and dead and buried and all that. And Peter gets upset. He said, no, you can read about all of this, of how Peter found his way back into relationship with Christ. I thought I've been thinking of the different places I've lived, the different things that I've seen, and I remember some of the phrases of people, the language. And I was thinking of if, when I lived down towards the South Shore of the Annapolis Valley, we had some friends from Yarmouth Way, from Clark's Harbor. And I remember one time they gave us a picture and they said, "Here, take this picture and hang it around back too." And I thought, I don't even know what that means. I don't know what you just said. And what that means is that you take the picture and you would hang it up, but the back would be out, not the picture. It's a kind of a way of saying, well, it's not a very good picture, but you can do with it what you want. Or I thought if you're from up west in West Prince area, and perhaps going out on a fishing excursion with one of the fishermen, and if there was a windy day with the rough seas, they might say something like, "It's pretty riley out there today. Better wait for a calm day." It means that the water's all riled up and wait for a calm day. The language we use indicates to us sometimes the part of the country we live in. If you're from Newfoundland, you might say, "My son, my son." If you're from Shediac, you might talk with a bit of an Acadian accent. The language we use signifies the country we're from. Now, I say that because of our own journey in the discovery of faith. And in our own journey in the discovery of faith, we find that God works in us much like he did in Peter. And in the working of God within us, a lot of times people will say things like this to me. They'll say, "I don't know what's happening to me, but the language I used to use, I don't use anymore." And they're referring to swear words. Or they'll say things like, "The jokes I used to find funny, they're not funny anymore." Or they'll say, the places I used to go and the things I used to like to do, it's not that I can't do them, I just don't want to do them anymore. Something has changed. You see, and the reality is just like Peter, that as we follow Jesus, he begins this molding, changing process within us, and all of a sudden we begin talking in a different way. We begin having different desires. We begin to want to be with the people of God more than anything else. And I suspect, just like Peter, if Jesus had have told Peter what his life would be like in the end of days, Peter would have had a hard time with that. And the same with you. Because God is molding you constantly in this journey of faith. So be encouraged. Maybe you have times when you're on the mountain with God, and maybe you have times when you're deep down into the valley. But our lives are to be lived not just on the mountain and not just in the valley, but on the ups and the downs as we go between them both. I want to challenge you today. I want you to look at your life of who you were and examine who you now are. Perhaps in the long run, God is calling you to be a great evangelist like Billy Graham. But if you're like all the rest of us, myself included, God calls you just to be you and who you are in Him. He calls you to be light in a dark place in your community. He calls you to be salt in a troubled world that preserves and flavors life. He calls you to love people who are difficult to love, maybe your neighbors. I want to challenge you as you follow Christ to follow Him in the fullness of the today. I learned a great lesson some time ago, and it's this: tomorrow is for tomorrow. Today is for today. And what I mean by that is all the things of tomorrow are for tomorrow. What I mean by that in the call of the discovery of faith is that who we are going to be tomorrow, we'll discover tomorrow. But today, make it your plan to illustrate, to show, to let Christ show through you in how you love, in what you do, and how you talk. I'm Pastor Mark Collins. I'm glad that you could join us for a few moments this afternoon. I pray God's richest blessings on you, that you too would be a blessing for Him. God bless you.